So your podcast is made, you've edited it, you've created a bit of buzz around it, and you're ready to get it out there. How do you do that? There are admittedly a lot of platforms where people listen to podcasts. We've already talked about Apple Podcasts, but Spotify is a big place. SoundCloud might be something you consider. YouTube has a growing audio audience. There's lots of different ways, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. So we're going to talk about just a couple simple things. You want to use a streaming service because these are really big files. So even if you are making this podcast for specific audiences, it would be very difficult to simply email the file across to them. So this is why people use Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube. The way to get onto these platforms, that is Apple and Spotify, is that you need to have something called an RSS feed. Now that is a feed that will update regularly every time you upload a new episode and will then automatically distribute it to all of the platforms that you have signed up to. So an RSS feed is vital if you want to be using multiple platforms. And how do you get one of these? There are actually loads of podcast platform providers that you can sign up to. We use Acast, which is ACAST, and it's a website that helps you generate your own website and material and upload everything through that, and then they automatically distribute it for you. You do have to, in the first instance, make sure that you've signed up to Apple and Spotify and all of these platforms individually. But after you get going, it'll happen for you because Apple and Spotify will just read your RSS feed. There are other versions of this. There's another one called Anchor, which I've heard really good things about. And the other thing is that these platforms then have support teams. So they will ensure that if you are struggling with something, you can just send a message and they'll help you with the answer for it. The thing to remember about using a platform like this is that you are then a client, not an owner. So you do own all your content. They can't take that away from you, but it is a service that they are giving to you. So if you want to add advertising and things like that, which is not necessarily for this project, but in future, you would then need to pay for that service. So just a different way of thinking about things, but we find it very useful, and you can take a look at those platforms to see actually a lot of really big podcasts do use those just for the ease of it. They're very simple, easy to use, and they help actually, even outside of Spotify and Apple, generate its own website, so you can just send a link to anyone that they can click on and listen to each individual episode. So they're very useful. Another thing about distribution platforms is that they provide for you analytics. I mentioned analytics in an earlier video. That means the data that is generated from your podcast. So data is important because it helps you understand what audiences you're accessing and if your podcast is doing what you wanted it to do. So you can see, especially on Spotify, the details of male or female, the country they're in, at what point in the episode they stopped listening, at what point people started listening again, how many people started it but didn't finish it. All those little details help you to fine-tune your work and make sure that it's interesting and that the people who are listening to it are getting something out of it. So it's very helpful for your own reflective practice. Unfortunately, data is money in this world. So we can get the basics of that for free, but if you want to get really, really involved, you do have to pay a fee to see all of your data. So again, as your podcast grows, maybe that's something you'd be interested in. We've not yet done that for Fluff, but it is our goal for the future. The first bit of marketing that is really important for your podcast is your podcast art. There are some really specific instructions about the size that a podcast art needs to be. So Google podcast art and find out how many pixels by pixels it needs to be. Your art should be striking. It needs to be something that makes people listen. But it also needs to be really simple, because if you imagine you're looking at this on your phone, it's going to fit into the side of your hand and it's going to be about the size of your thumbnail. So it needs to have the words, the title of your podcast really, really clear, and a really simple image. So we have a picture of the two of us on a pink background with just the word Fluff. And that's all it needs to be, and it's a really clear, small image. Take a look at different images on different podcasts and see what works for you. Marketing is also a really important part. You can put it on the platforms and still no one might listen to them because you need to create a general buzz before it becomes visible for the general public. One of the easiest ways to do this and most common ways is through social media. So for Fluff, we have both an Instagram account and a Twitter account, and we use them regularly. We post as often as possible. Twitter, generally, people only see what happens on Twitter if they're looking at it in that exact moment. So advice is post each episode multiple times because then you're more likely to see more and more people engaging with it. On Instagram, it's important to maintain a professional look. So for Fluff, we have a plan. Every episode, we create a new image for each episode based on the topic that involves our faces because our podcast is very much about who we are and what we are interested in. As well as we post quotes, we post feedback images, and everything has been photoshopped so that it looks and has the same branding. Through Apple Podcasts in particular, people can rate and review your podcast. Again, this is a helpful way to get some feedback, but it also means that Apple is going to take more notice of it. And Apple is huge. So if Apple thinks that your podcast is worth platforming, they will put it into the new and noteworthy section or trending top podcast this week. That's the only way to do that. So if you do want to get people, if you do want to make your podcast grow, rating and reviewing on the apps is really, really helpful and important. Inside each episode, we also will say at the end of the episode, sometimes at the beginning, you can follow us at Fluff Creatives. We will platform ourselves and ask for interaction with our podcast listeners because that is really important to us and it helps us continue, but also encourages them to boost our following. So the more you can sort of remind people who you are and where you are, the more likely you are to have listeners who engage with your work. You need to shout about it absolutely everywhere. Share it, share it, share it. Like I said before, you can post an episode 1,000,000 times. Even if it's a few weeks old, it might still be relevant. Email all your contacts with links to it. Utilize Central. Central have an amazing group of alumni who might want to be interested in your work. The more you can get it platformed through bigger institutions, the more likely you are to reach a wider audience. Jess and I also make sure that whenever we mention an organization or an individual in a podcast, which does happen quite frequently, that have an interest in our topic or because we've actually mentioned them and their product, we make sure that we send them the link in advance and say, hey, we've talked about you on our podcast this week. If you want to share it, that would be great. We don't do that for sponsorship yet, so we're not getting any sort of swag from this, but we are making sure that there's a network being created. So for example, in our body hair episode, we mentioned Open Barbers, which is a queer-friendly barber in London, and then we sent it to them afterwards and they shared it on their Instagram story. We've also mentioned a local brewery to where we are, who we've ordered some beer from during COVID-19 and asked them to share it on their platform. So those are audiences we would not normally be reaching. So for your task, I would like you to research different podcast distribution platforms and different ways that you can listen. Pick which one that you think is most accessible for you. Pick which one you think is most accessible for your audience and do some research and compile the pros and cons of each.